Sophia's phone buzzed again with a message from James, and for the first time in months, her heart skipped a beat, not out of excitement, but dread. She stared at the screen, the familiar glow of the message blinking back at her like an unwelcome reminder. Her fingers hovered over the keys, caught between the urge to respond and the fear of opening a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. It wasn't that she didn't like James, it was more that she didn't know what to do with him. She hadn't known what to do with anyone since Daniel. The memory of his voice, his touch, was still fresh enough to haunt her, yet distant enough to make her feel like she was living someone else's life. The message from James read, "How was your day? I hope it wasn't too stressful. I'm here if you need to talk." Her chest tightened. He wasn't the first person to ask how she was doing, but there was something about James's tone that always felt too much. Too perfect. Sophia scrolled back through their conversations, each word from him carefully chosen, like he'd studied her every reaction, like he knew the exact moments when she would need someone. It was unnerving. Yet, there was something comforting in it too, and she hated herself for finding solace in the very thing that made her uneasy. James had been persistent in a gentle way, always there, always attentive. It felt nice to have someone who noticed her, but the tenderness in his messages felt scripted, rehearsed. He hadn't yet crossed any lines, hadn't pushed her too far, but something about him set off an alarm deep inside her. The grief she carried for Daniel was still raw, unhealed, and every part of her screamed to guard it. Yet, she found herself drawn to James, even though her heart told her to keep him at arm's length. She wanted to move on, to feel alive again, but the walls she'd built around herself were fortified with doubt. She had no intention of diving back into dating. Hell, she wasn't even sure she knew how to date anymore. But there was something about James that made her wonder. He was careful with his words, and when he spoke, it felt like he knew exactly what to say. It was as if he could see the sorrow buried under her polite responses, the pain she hadn't expressed. It made her feel vulnerable, even though she hadn't opened up to him about Daniel's death. She was cautious, but he seemed to know exactly how to bridge the gap between them. Sophia let the phone rest in her lap and took a deep breath. This wasn't a decision she could make lightly. A part of her wanted to tell him to stop. Another part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could offer her something she hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to hope again. She had been talking to him for weeks now, cautiously, weighing every word, unsure of what it meant, or what it might lead to. But she couldn't ignore the pull. It wasn't love, she told herself. It was just a longing for connection, a flicker of warmth in the cold, empty space Daniel had left behind. She typed back, carefully choosing her words. "My day was fine, thank you. Just, still getting used to everything. It's hard, you know. But I'm managing." The reply came almost immediately. "I know it's hard. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." Sophia set the phone down again and exhaled, the knot in her chest tightening further. Why did he have to make it sound so personal? So intimate? It was as if he had been listening in on her heart and knew just what to say to make her feel safe, to make her feel understood. It made her want to run from the conversation, but another part of her just needed it. Needed to be seen. Needed to be heard. A few days later, after much deliberation, Sophia found herself agreeing to meet James in person. Her hesitation had almost stopped her, but the thought of meeting someone new, someone who could offer her even a brief escape from the grief that weighed on her, was too tempting to ignore. She wanted to see if he was as real as he seemed, or if he was simply another illusion in a world where trust felt like a foreign language. When they met, James was exactly as he appeared in his photos, handsome, with an easy smile and warm eyes that seemed to take in everything about her. They had agreed to meet at a small cafe, somewhere casual, neutral. Yet, even in the dim lighting of the place, the warmth he exuded felt overwhelming. He was the type of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the room. And for that moment, Sophia felt special, something she hadn't felt in so long. He greeted her with a soft, "Sophia," his voice low and soothing, as though he'd known her forever. "Hi," she replied, her voice catching slightly. She wasn't sure if it was nerves or something else, but the moment their eyes met, she felt a flutter deep inside. He was a stranger, but she felt like she had known him for much longer than just a few weeks of texting. The conversation began easily enough, small talk about work, the weather, even the book she was reading. James was attentive, hanging on to every word she said, but there was something about the way he listened that felt too much, like he was studying her, picking apart her sentences for clues. She wasn't sure if it was his gaze or the way his brow furrowed slightly whenever she spoke, but she felt like he was reading her in a way that felt unsettling. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "I know it's hard. You don't have to hide it from me. I understand. I've seen how you try to push it all down." Sophia froze. She hadn't said anything about Daniel, not directly. So how did he know? She stared at him for a moment, trying to gauge his expression, but his face was soft, understanding. It didn't look like manipulation, at least not in the traditional sense. But something in her gut twisted. "I'm not pretending," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. James smiled slightly, but there was something behind it that didn't feel right. "It's okay, Sophia. I get it. It's all still fresh. But you're not alone anymore. You don't have to keep everything bottled up." Her heart pounded in her chest. He was too perfect. Too understanding. Too everything. By the end of the date, Sophia felt herself letting her guard down, even though a small voice in the back of her mind was still warning her. She wanted to believe James, she wanted to believe that someone could care about her, that someone could heal her broken heart. He made her feel safe, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led somewhere she didn't want to go. Over the next few weeks, they continued to see each other. Each date was more intimate than the last. He was patient, kind, and always there when she needed him. Slowly, despite her doubts, Sophia allowed herself to become emotionally invested. He was everything she had wanted, someone who listened, someone who cared, someone who understood her pain. But there was always that voice in the back of her mind. The one that told her she was falling for something that wasn't real. James was too perfect. His timing, his understanding, his presence, it all felt rehearsed. As if he was trying too hard to fit into a role that wasn't his. She tried to push those thoughts aside, convincing herself she was just being paranoid. But they lingered, growing louder with each passing day. Then James suggested a weekend getaway, a special trip to a secluded cabin, far away from the distractions of the city. His insistence that they go felt a little too forceful. She agreed, hoping that the time away might help clear her head, might help her understand if what she felt for James was real, or just a product of her loneliness. As they arrived at the secluded location, Sophia's sense of unease deepened. The small cabin tucked away in the woods was charming in its isolation, but there was something about James's demeanor that made her feel uncomfortable. He had been insistent on getting her alone, away from anyone who might see them together. The way he had manipulated the situation, how quickly he had organized the trip, made Sophia feel like she had been cornered. Her unease turned to dread as the realization sank in. She had walked into something she didn't fully understand, and James's true intentions were starting to feel less than genuine. The weekend started with the kind of quiet that only isolation could bring. The small cabin nestled in the woods was charming in a rustic way, but the stillness felt unnerving. As Sophia sat on the porch, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup, she tried to focus on the sound of the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, but the unease gnawing at her stomach wouldn't let her forget why she was here. James was inside, his presence filling the room even when he wasn't physically near. At first, his attentiveness had been comforting. he had been there when she needed him most. But now, it felt more like a cage. His insistence on the weekend getaway, the way he had subtly pushed her into agreeing to this isolated retreat, made her question how much of it had been her choice. As the hours passed, she began to notice things about him that unsettled her. James, the charming man who had once seemed so perfect, was becoming someone she didn't recognize. His smile, once warm and reassuring, now carried a possessive edge. It was in the way he looked at her, a calculating glint in his eyes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He asked too many questions, about her past, her habits, her friends, questions that felt intrusive, as if he were trying to peel away the layers of her life to expose something hidden beneath. They were sitting down for dinner, and James had just brought up her old friends again, asking how they were, if she still talked to them. The tone of his voice was casual, but there was an edge to it. "Are you still in touch with Clara?" he asked, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork, his eyes never leaving her face. Sophia hesitated. She hadn't talked to Clara in weeks. There hadn't been time. She'd been so focused on her own grief and her time with James that she'd drifted away from most of her old connections. "I don't talk to her much anymore," Sophia said, her voice soft, trying to keep things neutral. James's eyes sharpened. "I thought you two were close." She nodded, not quite meeting his gaze. "We were. We still are, I guess. Just busy." He leaned back in his chair, staring at her for a moment before nodding. "You know, I've noticed you've been distant with a lot of people lately." Sophia stiffened. The way he said it felt like an accusation, though he hadn't raised his voice. His smile remained, but the warmth was gone. Instead, there was a coolness in the air, an undertone of something else, something darker. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "I've just been focusing on myself," she replied, her voice tight. "I'm not good at juggling everything." James didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, with a slight smile, he said, "That's good. You don't need anyone else. Not when you have me." The words lingered in the air, heavy and thick with meaning. Sophia didn't know how to respond. Was this normal? Was this how it was supposed to feel? He wasn't being cruel, but something about his tone, his insistence, made her skin crawl. She realized then that she was becoming more and more dependent on him, and it made her anxious. She had given him so much of herself without even realizing it. As the evening wore on, Sophia grew more restless. She tried to ignore the creeping discomfort and focus on the surroundings, the peacefulness of the forest, the crackling fire in the cabin's fireplace. But James seemed to be everywhere, his attention constant, his presence inescapable. That night, as they settled in for bed, Sophia's unease escalated. She had always been a light sleeper, but now every creak of the house felt like an alarm bell. The house was far too quiet. Too isolated. James, however, seemed unfazed. He rolled over in the bed, pulling her closer than she was comfortable with, his arm wrapped tightly around her. "I don't want you to go anywhere tomorrow," he murmured, his voice low. "Just stay with me. We don't need anyone else." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The implication of his words hit her like a wave, and she instinctively pulled away, trying to put some space between them. "I'm not going anywhere. I just need some air," she muttered, scrambling out of bed. James didn't stop her, but the silence that followed was filled with tension. She stepped outside, gulping down the cool night air, but the fresh air didn't seem to clear her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. Every decision she'd made since arriving here felt wrong now. This wasn't just a weekend getaway. This wasn't a man who was trying to help her heal, he was trying to control her. The next morning, Sophia did her best to shake off the unease. She told herself she was just being paranoid, that James was nothing more than an overly attentive man trying to make her feel cared for. But when they went into town, and James insisted she cancel her plans with her friends the next day, the warning bells in her head grew louder. "I thought you were planning to catch up with Clara tomorrow," he said, the question casual but laced with something else. "Why don't we just spend the day together instead?" Sophia hesitated, caught off guard by his request. She hadn't even planned to see Clara, but the way James was phrasing it made her feel guilty. "I thought I might, but I'm okay. I don't mind hanging out with you." James's smile was approving. "Good. You don't need to worry about anyone else. You just need me." Something in his voice made her stomach churn. The possessiveness was subtle but unmistakable. She forced a smile, trying to keep the situation light, but a part of her felt trapped. It was as though James was trying to isolate her, and the more he tried, the more desperate she became to get away. Later that afternoon, while James was preparing lunch, Sophia wandered around the cabin, her curiosity getting the better of her. As she explored, she came across an odd assortment of things tucked away in drawers and cupboards, papers, personal belongings that didn't belong to either of them. One drawer held a stack of documents with names that didn't sound familiar. Another cupboard was filled with items James had never mentioned before, odd knickknacks and books that weren't in line with his personality. A chill ran down her spine as she opened a closet door to find an empty space, far too large for a single jacket or bag. She had seen James spend time in that closet before, but he had never opened the door wide enough for her to see inside. Now that she could, it was as though the hidden corner of the house had been waiting for her discovery. "Looking for something?" James's voice startled her, and she spun around to see him standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. She quickly shut the closet door, trying to steady her breath. "Just looking around," she replied, her voice betraying her. "I didn't realize this place had so many hidden spaces." James stepped closer, his demeanor calm but unsettling. "You shouldn't go snooping around. It's not good for our relationship." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, his need for control, his possessiveness. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I wasn't snooping. I was just curious." "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said, the smile that followed not quite reaching his eyes. The tension in the cabin was unbearable now, and it wasn't just the silence. It was the way James had started to look at her, like she was something to possess, to be owned. When Sophia tried to distance herself, when she tried to push back against his need to control, he grew distant, cold, and then warm again. It was a cycle she couldn't escape, a push and pull that left her dizzy and unsure of where she stood. By the time evening arrived, the tension had boiled over. James confronted her after dinner, his voice raised just enough to send a shiver down her spine. "I know what you're doing," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You don't trust me. You're pushing me away." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words got caught in her throat. The accusation felt wrong, and yet, it felt true. She had been trying to protect herself, to keep some part of her intact. But James wouldn't allow it. "You've been distant ever since we got here," he continued, his voice quieter now, but filled with frustration. "Why? Do you not trust me?" Sophia tried to back away, but James grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. "Answer me." She tugged her arm away, her pulse racing. "Let go of me," she snapped. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in one swift motion, James pulled her into him, holding her against him so tightly she couldn't breathe. The struggle, the fear, the realization, it all crashed in on her at once. This wasn't just a weekend getaway anymore. James wasn't the man she thought he was. And he had no intention of letting her leave. "I've been playing you, Sophia," James whispered, his voice cold. "All along. You were never meant to leave here. You were always meant to be part of the plan." Sophia's heart stopped. She hadn't wanted to believe it. But now, she had no choice. As the weekend continues, Sophia paced the small cabin, her thoughts spiraling. The walls, once a comforting refuge, now felt like a prison. It wasn't the cabin itself, no, it was James, his presence like a shadow lurking behind every corner. He had manipulated her, subtly and expertly, until now. The door was locked. The windows were too high to climb out of. There was no escape. At first, she had told herself this was just a misstep, a weekend gone wrong, a misunderstanding. But now, as each hour passed in this confined space, the weight of her realization was suffocating. There was no more pretending. She was here, in this isolated place, with no way out. And James, he wasn't who she thought he was. He was worse. Sophia had thought she was just being paranoid. She had thought she could push through the doubts and let herself be taken care of, to find some semblance of healing. But James wasn't trying to help her. He wasn't a caring man, a lonely soul reaching out to heal his own broken heart. He was a predator. And she had walked straight into his trap. His words echoed in her head, cold and accusing. "You're mine now." The finality in his voice still rang in her ears. She had been sold. This wasn't some cruel game, some twisted romantic gesture. No, this was a business transaction. She had been nothing more than a target. A vulnerable woman, grieving the loss of her fiancé, too easy to manipulate. The thought hit her hard. Her stomach turned as the magnitude of it sank in. He had studied her pain, learned her weaknesses, and used them against her. He hadn't cared about her grief. He'd only cared about how it could get him what he wanted. James hadn't been there to help her heal. He had been here to make her his possession, a pawn in a larger scheme. The tension continued to escalate. The once peaceful cabin now felt oppressive, the silence thick with uncertainty. Each movement James made seemed to tighten the noose around her. His actions, his words, no longer seemed like they were aimed at comfort or connection. They were control, pure and simple. Sophia's every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away from him. But where could she go? The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was miles away, and James had made it clear that any attempts to leave would be met with severe consequences. He had already shut down any chance of escape, locking her in and keeping a constant eye on her. And yet, somehow, in the back of her mind, a glimmer of hope began to flicker. There had to be a way out. She couldn't accept this fate. Not now. Not after everything. She had to fight. She had to survive. When James left the cabin that afternoon, Sophia's chance came. She watched him drive off, his car disappearing down the winding path toward the main road. The brief window of freedom sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had minutes, maybe an hour, before he returned. And in that time, she had to make something happen. She rushed to the window, pressing her palms against the glass, straining to see through the heavy curtains. The sight of the empty road only made her stomach churn. She had been alone here for too long. The isolation had begun to eat at her mind, twisting her thoughts, blurring the line between fear and reality. But now, she had a plan. Sophia turned back to the cabin, her pulse quickening as she scanned the room. There had to be something, anything, that could help her escape. She moved quickly, searching for any tools, any objects that could break the locks or open the windows. She rummaged through drawers, upturning furniture, feeling like a caged animal. Her hands shook with urgency, every second slipping through her fingers like sand. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming faster as she realized she had no time left. She pulled open a drawer that had been locked earlier and found what she was looking for, a small set of tools. A lockpick kit, perhaps something James had been using to keep her contained. She held the kit in her hand, her mind racing. She could do this. She could escape. All she needed was to find the right door, the right window. She just had to be quick. And quiet. She had no idea when James would return. Sophia moved toward the back door, holding her breath. The lock was old, rusty, and after a few moments of fumbling with the picks, she managed to hear a soft click. It was open. Her heart soared with the hope she hadn't dared to believe in before. She had a chance. She wasn't trapped. Not yet. But as she took a step toward the door, the sound of tires on gravel froze her in place. James was back. Her blood ran cold. The fleeting hope she had felt just seconds earlier died in an instant. Panic surged through her, and she pushed the lockpick kit into her pocket, turning on her heel to hide it. She quickly shut the door and pretended to casually walk back to the living room, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. The door opened with a creak, and there he was, James, standing in the doorway with that same unnerving smile. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if taking in every detail. "How's the fresh air?" he asked, his voice smooth, but there was something dark in the way he spoke now. The false sweetness was gone. Sophia couldn't meet his gaze. She wasn't sure if he knew she had tried to escape, or if he was just suspicious of her increasing unease. Either way, it didn't matter. He had her. "I needed a break," she managed to say, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "The cabin feels too closed in sometimes." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a sharp click. The moment the door was shut, Sophia felt the weight of the walls closing in again. His presence filled the room. "You've been very quiet today," he said, his tone taking on an edge that made her stomach twist. "Too quiet." Before she could respond, he reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. She recoiled instinctively, but he held her tighter. "What did you think you were doing?" His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think you can leave?" Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears as she struggled to free herself from his grip. But James was stronger than she had anticipated. He yanked her back toward him, forcing her to face him. "I wasn't," she started, but he cut her off. "You weren't thinking," he sneered, his face twisting into something that no longer resembled the caring man she had once known. "You never were. I've been studying you, Sophia. I know exactly what you are. What you need. And now, you're mine." Fear surged through Sophia like a tidal wave. She was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The desperate escape she had almost made was a false hope. James wasn't just controlling her now. He was locking her in, pulling her deeper into the web he had spun. "Let me go," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, let me go." James's eyes softened for a moment, but the pity in them only made her more afraid. "You don't understand, Sophia. You never understood. This was never about you. This was about something much bigger than you. You were never meant to escape." And that was when it hit her. James's smile faded as he grabbed her by the wrist and yanked her toward the back of the cabin, toward the place she hadn't seen, the secret she hadn't even known existed. The door opened to reveal an underground passageway, dark and narrow, stretching into the bowels of the earth. Sophia's heart froze. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This was bigger than her. This was bigger than James. This wasn't just about her. This was a human trafficking operation. And she was just one piece in a much larger game. Sophia sat in the small, dimly lit room, her body slumped against the wall. Her muscles ached from days of confinement, her mind spinning in a haze of exhaustion and dread. The isolation in this cabin had begun to feel like a suffocating blanket, smothering any remaining hope she had left. James had manipulated her, broken her down with his false promises and gentle words, only to trap her in this nightmare. And now, he was closing in on her, his presence looming like a dark cloud. She was drained. Physically, emotionally, and mentally. Every breath felt heavier than the last. She had no way out. No chance of escape. Or so she thought. But even in the darkest corner of her mind, something refused to give up. The fight wasn't over yet. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. James had spent days wearing her down, using her grief as a weapon, making her feel like she was losing her mind. But today, there was a shift. The terror that had gripped her was now replaced with a growing anger, a defiance that she could no longer suppress. She was done being a pawn in his sick game. She would not let him break her completely. Sophia didn't know how, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't give up now. The sound of footsteps outside the room snapped her from her thoughts. James was coming. The familiar dread washed over her, but this time, she didn't let it consume her. Instead, she focused, trying to steady her breathing, trying to silence the fear that had been her constant companion since she had stepped into this cabin. The door creaked open, and James stepped inside, holding a tray of food. His eyes flicked over her, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "You need to eat," he said, his voice cool and detached. "You're looking a little pale. We wouldn't want you getting sick now, would we?" Sophia didn't respond. Her eyes flicked over to the tray, but the last thing she wanted was food from him. She didn't want anything from him anymore. He had taken so much from her already, and she wasn't about to let him feed her lies along with the meal. James placed the tray on the small table beside her, and for a moment, he simply stood there, watching her with that calculating gaze. It was as if he was waiting for her to break, for her to crumble under the weight of his control. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. As he turned to leave, she felt the anger flare within her. She had to do something. She had to act. The urge to fight, to escape, was too strong to ignore. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing as she searched for something, anything, to defend herself. The opportunity came when James turned his back to her, heading toward the door. Without thinking, Sophia shot to her feet, her body moving on instinct. She grabbed the heavy metal rod from the corner of the room, an old piece of furniture she had noticed earlier. She swung it with all her strength, catching James off guard. The rod connected with his skull with a sickening thud, and for a split second, he crumpled to the floor, stunned. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she stood over him, breathless, her mind racing. He was still breathing, still alive, but she couldn't afford to wait around to see what he would do next. She had no time. This was her chance. Her only chance. She dashed toward the door, her body trembling with adrenaline as she threw it open and bolted outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap to the face, but she didn't stop. She ran, her feet pounding against the dirt path, the cabin now a distant blur behind her. She didn't look back. Not even once. Her eyes landed on the truck parked nearby, James's truck. The keys were in the ignition, just as she had hoped. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. It was her only way out. With trembling hands, she climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. Her heart was in her throat, her mind screaming at her to drive, to get as far away from this place as possible. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers slick with sweat, but finally, the engine roared to life. She floored the gas pedal, sending the truck lurching forward. The tires kicked up dirt as she tore down the path, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. She didn't know how long she had before James would come after her, but she didn't intend to find out. She was going to escape. She was going to survive. The road ahead was a blur, her eyes focused only on the headlights illuminating the darkness. The truck's tires ate up the ground beneath her as she pushed forward, the sound of the engine drowning out the noise in her head. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, but she didn't care. She had one goal, freedom. Her heart slammed against her chest. She could see the lights in the distance, the faint outline of the town up ahead. She had to make it. With a desperate surge of energy, she pushed the truck faster, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. She was so close to safety. And then, finally, the lights of the town flickered into view. The road ahead was a blur of streetlights and buildings. She could see the police station in the distance. She knew she had made it. Sophia screeched the truck to a halt in front of the police station, jumping out of the driver's seat before it had even fully stopped. She ran inside, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her heart racing. "I need help," she gasped, her voice ragged as she stumbled to the front desk. "There's a man. He's been..." Before she could finish, the officers were already moving, their hands on their radios, sending out alerts. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, questions, and quiet relief. The police had been quick to respond, sending a team out to the cabin immediately. They found James still lying unconscious, his injuries from the rod to the head enough to incapacitate him. When they searched the cabin, they found more than just the makeshift prison he had created for Sophia. They found the evidence, the documents, the plans, the connections to a much larger human trafficking operation. Sophia's bravery had been the catalyst for the dismantling of the entire network. The operation James had been a part of was far more extensive than she had ever imagined. He wasn't the only one. There were other victims, other women who had been trapped in the same way she had, lured in by false promises and manipulation. As the police worked to piece together the full scope of the operation, Sophia learned that James wasn't the first person to use her grief against her. He had done this before, using vulnerable women to further his own twisted agenda. And as the authorities reached out to other survivors, more women came forward, their stories eerily similar to hers. Sophia sat in the quiet of her small apartment, the weight of everything she had been through settling heavily on her shoulders. The world outside was bright, but she felt nothing but exhaustion. She had survived. She had escaped. But there was no real victory here, only relief. She stared out the window, the memories of everything she had lost creeping in. But even in the quiet moments, even in the stillness, she knew she had regained something that James could never take from her, her strength. "I thought I had lost everything," she whispered to herself, the words sounding hollow but true. "Turns out, I only had to lose him." And with that, the door to her past finally closed.